Good afternoon, readers. It's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf, and today I'm going to do my Victober wrap-up. So Victober is a wonderful month-long read-along of Victorian literature, as we all know, and love and enjoy every year. And I'll just quickly run through the hosts and the prompts. So what I was thinking of doing this prompt by prompt, but instead I'm going to do it based on what I read and then refer to how they met the prompts as I go through, because most things met most prompts, just because of how the prompts were this year. So Katie at Books and Things, her prompt was a book that played with form. Kate from Kate Howe, her prompt was a book that was about religion. Marissa, a blatantly bookish, something that was serialised. Ros at Scally Dandling about the books, hers was to read or experience a play. Then we had the group challenge, which was in memory of two booktubers that we've sadly lost since last year. So read something by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle in memory of Alice in the Giant Bookshelf. Alice and the Giant Bookshelf, and read something by Wilkie in memory of Jennifer Brooks. So it's really nice that we're able to sort of include them in our Victober experience. And then the group read was The Doctor's Wife by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. For various reasons, I didn't have as full on a Victober this year as I have done on some previous years, but I was still pretty pleased with how much I managed to read and achieved. So I'm going to pitch straight in to talk about that. So my main book for Victober was Little Dorrit. So my personal Victober challenge is to read a new Dickens every year. Little Dorrit, I enjoyed it so much that when I came to planning this video, I felt that I had way too much to say about it, and I created a completely separate Little Dorrit review video so that I can try and keep this section a little bit more in proportion. So I'm going to keep my thoughts to just what is about the prompts. Just my general summary of my feelings about Little Dorrit. It's not my favourite Dickens book. It was my favourite book that I read this year for Victober, and it's definitely an absolute masterpiece and quite high up on the tier of Victorian literature. It's just it's competing in a high range when you compare it to other Dickens major works. So in terms of meeting the prompts then, it doesn't really play with form at all. There's a couple of chapters that are written in letter form. I have to say that those are absolutely the weakest chapters for me. But in general, it's just a straight big chunky Dickens novel. Religion, there are a couple of references to religion that I picked up on just because that was the prompt. I wouldn't say it's a major theme of the book at all. So we've got an unnamed character that's just referred to as Bishop, and this character, or I should say, if you don't know Little Dorrit, the premise of Little Dorrit is that it focuses around a family that have been in a debtor's prison, in particular around Amy Dorrit, who was born in the debtor's prison, and she's now about 20 years old, and her life is sort of starting to expand beyond the walls of the prison, but her family is still very much tied to this experience of imprisonment. As with all Dickens novels, though, he expands way beyond that. So the Bishop is in the other extreme of society from Little Dorrit. Little Dorrit is in the prison setting, and the Bishop is in the high society part of the book. And this character is meant to be sort of a generic character of somebody very high up in the church, and stands in for like the type of organised religion. And he's portrayed in quite a negative light. He's shown as being willing to completely toady up to a wealthy capitalist character called Mr. Merdle. He's doing that for sort of influence, trying to sound a little bit better than some of the other people who are toadying up to Mr. Merdle, but still very much out for gains for himself and his profession, and the only time we see him is going to these like super elaborate social events, so we don't see him as like at all any kind of idea of humble Christianity in any way. So it's fairly damning. But on the other side, in Little Dorrit's kind of sphere, we do have the clergyman who works in the church that's nearest to the Marshalsea prison, who is involved in her life. Like he's there when she's born, not there when she's born, but he records her in the register of births. He helps her in one specific occasion where she has nowhere to go on one night, and he looks after her, and then he's there at later life events. So we get this kind of, and he has like this affection for her because he has seen the progress of her life. And I guess it also shows that he's been there for all of those 20 odd years, so he knows the kind of the story of his parishioners. So yeah, the two extremes of organised religion and like the top of organised religion and the local kind of parish, I suppose. Then going back to, so the next prompt for serialisation, Little Dorrit definitely meets that prompt. It was serialised from 1855 to 1857. I did think it was serialised in Household Words, but when I was looking it up, it seems like it was actually its own thing, so you could just buy issues of Little Dorrit just by itself, which I guess shows the confidence that they felt that it could sell. My edition was Penguin Classics edition, and it put an asterisk. It was on Kindle, so I'm not going to bother to try and hold anything up today. Put an asterisk at the end of each serialised section, and you could really see how the serialisation affected the pacing. So at the start of each serialised section, you'd have a chapter that was maybe a lot of scene setting, quite relaxed in pace, very descriptive, very indulgent, I suppose, and not at all kind of plot vital. They might do a bit of like character development, introduce some character dynamics, but yeah, mostly sort of scene setting. And then as you got through to the end of the instalment, you would get kind of slightly more action, slightly more emotion involved, and by the end of the chapter, the end of the instalment, almost always there was some kind of cliffhanger or some kind of mystery or question to resolve. I would say one of the things reading Little Dorrit and then thinking back to other Dickens novels, I never realised how brilliant of a mystery writer Dickens is, and that's why his books work so well. They're so big, but the mystery in the heart of them is powerful enough that it keeps you reading. So serialisation definitely had an impact there. The next book that I read was The Doctor's Wife by Mary Elizabeth Braddon, and that was, as you know, the group read. I think everybody had sort of mixed feelings about this book. Some people loved it, some people didn't finish it. The same with any group read, like there's always going to be a mixture of experiences. And I believe the idea this year was to pick something that wasn't like one of the big names, and maybe focus on a female author and a book that was less familiar. So I was really glad to be pushed to read something by somebody that I wouldn't have picked up otherwise, probably. I would have probably read another Hardy or another Bronte that I hadn't read, because I'm still, although I've been doing Victober for years, I still feel that I'm not really deep in with Victorian literature. I've still got so much to cover. I've barely started on Trollope, there's a long way to go. So I was glad to be kind of pushed to try something a little bit different. And my general thoughts were, this reminded me most of North and South, but North and South I would happily reread, and I have reread it several times, but I wouldn't really reread The Doctor's Wife. It's good, but it's really not at the peak. There's a reason why some books are loved and remembered more than others. I found the character of, so it's a basically an adultery temptation type plot, and it's supposed to be inspired by Madame Bovary by Flaubert, Gustave Flaubert. I found the main female character of Isabel was weirdly too virtuous and naive, despite the fact that she's kind of getting involved with a man who's not her husband. You get, like, one of the things she does well is like showing us why characters are the way they are. And I loved particularly the description of her husband Gilbert, like coming back and doing the same thing every day and just eating his radishes and spring onions, and just like how that gradually gets more and more grating for Isabel. I didn't particularly like Roland either, who was the man that she was tempted by. I have to say I really appreciated the ending of this story. I've read a lot of Victorian or similar kind of era sort of fallen women type stories, and they typically go a certain way, and I like the way that, without giving anything away, I like that how my expectations were subverted when it came to the ending. It was just handled better than the ending of better than I expected it would be based on the book so far. So yeah, that was probably the best part of it. The very end was the best part. So it doesn't really play with form at all. It's just a standard book. In terms of religion, that was again quite a minor theme that I only picked up on because we were talking about it. So we get some references to Isabel's personal morality and how there's sort of a lack of support for her morality from her own local church. So it's quite critical of sort of small parish religion, where I guess the person in each church was somebody who'd, posh young man who was sent to Oxford, was ordained because that was, you know, one of the very few career options, and then spends his life sort of preaching about esoteric matters of religion that matter to him, but don't actually matter to the moral well-being of his, what do they call it? Congregation, that's the word. So quite critical of that, but then later in the book, she goes to a neighbouring village and she sees somebody preaching who really is able to sort of engage with her and talk about values and morals. So you see how that affects how she feels in herself, and she becomes sort of more devout in response to this. It doesn't seem to be something that's carried on consistently, but it was just interesting to see how the two different sort of pastors managed their congregations. It's also got a classic deathbed scene with loads of sentimental religiosity. That's like a classic a staple of Victorian literature. You get deathbed scenes in Little Dorrit as well. Yeah, I love-hate Victorian deathbed scenes because they're so unrealistic, but they're also like so juicily melodramatic and overwritten that it's kind of enjoyable, even though it's also utterly absurd. So serialisation, The Doctor's Wife was serialised in Temple Bar in 1864, so a little bit later than Little Dorrit. It seemed to really suffer from the serialisation. So Dickens was a master of that serialisation form. I felt that Mary Elizabeth Braddon was not. And it seemed very repetitive between sections. And I almost felt like, you know, when you read a big fantasy series or any kind of series, and in the start of the second and the third book, the author feels the need to do a little recap of everything that's happened so far, just in case the reader's forgotten, or in case they just started with the second book for whatever weird reason. I felt like that was the case, and that was why she was writing in this repetitive way, as if she felt that I can't guarantee that people are going to bother to remember my story, and I might be like thinking that she wasn't the main author that people were buying this magazine for. So they might be reading it and she was trying to like catch them up as they were reading alongside like a different book. So yeah, I just felt like it was that kind of like recap or summary constantly, which when you're reading the whole thing at once is quite jarring. I think it might be the kind of book that you want to read either really fast or really slow. I think the pace that the group read was set at was not great for a lot of people. Because I thought I wouldn't be able to keep up the pace with the group read, I just read it all in one go, more or less. So I read it within about a week, and that did work relatively well. The pacing also fluctuated hugely within the instalments, which I guess maybe she was doing a similar thing to Dickens. I didn't have the divisions marked so clearly in my edition, so I don't know exactly where the divides were. And there was a lot of repetition even within paragraphs. And I kind of felt that was maybe to do with like maybe pressure for copy and material. So in the book, there's this brilliant character called Sigismund Smith, who is a sensation book writer. And he makes a lot of references to like editors demanding copy or wanting to know what the next illustration should be about, and like the pressures on him as a writer who's writing on demand. And I kind of felt like, I think a lot of people felt that was a bit self-referential, I suppose. And that maybe some of the repetitions sort of crept in because she had to write a certain number of pages for that week's issue, and so she just like, oh, let's just fill these pages and just like boost them by repeating almost the same sentence but just slightly different structure. But yeah, it wasn't the best reading experience because of that. Overall though, I'm glad that I read it, and I feel like it was worth going into, and just, yeah, different approach. And I liked it a lot better than I liked Madame Bovary, which I really didn't like. I didn't particularly like. I then read a couple of short story collections. So the first one of those was The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. So this was obviously for the group challenge in honour of Alice. And this one does play with form a little bit because it purports to be the memoirs of Dr. Watson as he is recounting what has happened between him and Sherlock Holmes. And he'll refer back to, oh yeah, that was in the year of this when my wife was on holiday, so I went to see Sherlock Holmes. Or, I was popping along seeing my patients, and then I bumped into Sherlock Holmes and we went off on this very exciting case. So there's this kind of theme in the other short story collection that I read as well of claiming that the stories were true, which obviously the reader knows that it isn't, but it adds a kind of another level, I suppose, to the experience. I quite like it. there's very minimal religion involved in Sherlock Holmes, unless we count him using religious characters as a disguise a couple of times. It's much later, so I think it's 18. Oh yeah, it was also kind of serialized. So it was serialized as individual short stories in the Strand magazine from 1891 to 92. And I think because of it being later in the Victorian era, some of the things that are really important, sort of in the 1850s, 60s, 70s. Yeah, it's just the society has changed and the structure has changed. So my general thoughts was this was probably my most enjoyable Victober read. I really romped through it. Sherlock Holmes stories, they really keep me engaged. This is a reread for me. Some of the stories I've read sort of 3 times now. Most of them I've read about twice. Previously I was listening to the Stephen Fry audiobook. This time I was just reading it on Kindle. I think Sherlock Holmes is a lot better in short stories than in the longer works. I really enjoy these little snippets, but I do find that things like The Study in Scarlet, Hound of the Baskervilles, they're a little bit long, and then the far-fetched elements bother me more. Like, there's definitely far-fetched bits in the stories, in the short stories, but they're so quick that it doesn't really matter. You just enjoy getting through them. One thing that I particularly noticed was the female characters in Sherlock Holmes compared to the rest of my Victober reading. I was just inundated with really kind of annoying Victorian young women that were overly kind of virtuous angel in the house type characters that weren't particularly enjoyable. But Sherlock Holmes has got a lot of women who could take care of themselves. You know, they're employed, they're out there sorting out, like participating in these murder mystery situations or mystery experiences. And yeah, I appreciated seeing a little bit of that. I would not at all say that Sherlock Holmes's gender dynamics are perfect. And definitely it's written from the point of view that women are definitely, according to Holmes and just the system, women are definitely one step down from men. But you can see these women having a lot more independence and a lot more sort of confidence, acting as decision makers and so on than the other books I read. I guess that's kind of because these are later Victorians, so we get this kind of new women era, and Doyle's probably responding to that. The last main thing that I read then was After Dark by Wilkie Collins. Again, this was for the group challenge, and it was in memory of Jennifer Brooks, who really loved Wilkie Collins's many of Wilkie Collins's stories. So this was not serialised, but it was partially published in Household Words as separate stories, and then it was gathered together into one collection. So Wilkie Collins and Charles Dickens seem to have got along pretty well, so there was a lot of kind of interaction between their writings. This was my main pick for playing with form because this short story collection has got a framing device. So it's framed by Leah's diaries, and Leah is the wife of a struggling artist, and she writes how her husband has lost his sight temporarily, and they have no income, they're really stuck. What are they going to do? And suddenly she realises that her husband has picked up loads of really fascinating stories from the people that he's painted portraits of, and she persuades him to tell her those stories, and she writes them down, and these are the stories that we get in the collection. So we get her diaries, and then we get his explanation of how he came to have heard that specific story, and then we get the stories themselves. I have to say, I really much preferred Leah and her husband as characters, and their parts of the story to the individual stories in the book, and I would have loved to hear more about them, like more extracts from Leah's diary in between each story, for instance. I think that would have added a lot to the book. As it stands, we get a lot more in the world of each individual story. And again, it's that kind of premise that the stories that are being told are true, to just add that layer, particularly when the stories are quite extreme in some cases. There's a lot of murder, a lot of kind of subterfuge, almost ghostly moments. So it was quite good for a kind of Halloween-y time read. Yeah, so adding that pretense that it's true seemed to be something that appealed to Victorian readers. I have not written down when this was published, sorry, because I've got to the end of my notes. I'm kind of off for freestyling from here. But yeah, in general, I felt that the way that it plays with form was quite interesting, but it wasn't my favourite Victober read. Religion comes up quite a lot because for some reason Wilkie Collins seems obsessed with setting things in France, and he's got a lot of references to sort of French Catholic characters. There's one story in particular where there's a lot of references to the sort of superstition of the family, and it's set at the time of the French Revolution. A couple of them were set around different phases of the French Revolution, and talking about, you know, how the persecution, religious persecution that happened at that time, alongside the sort of the general persecution and the terror and so on. So religion was a bigger theme in this short story collection than in anything else that I read, but I felt that it was done in a little bit of a stereotyped way, that Collins perhaps didn't really know much about French Catholicism, or he had very set views on that were maybe not accurate to what Catholicism was like at that time. I don't know, that was just my impression from reading it, that he was just using it to, much as it's used in earlier works like things by Anne Radcliffe, using the idea of somebody being of the Catholic Church as creating kind of like a setup for things to be a bit more gruesome and superstitious and unrealistic. Like, oh, you know, we're nice, settled, normal England, but over there in France, all the drama stuff happens. So yeah, I just get that impression. So that was religion. I've mentioned serialization. I've mentioned form. So general impressions then. This was probably my least enjoyed work for Victober this year. I really enjoyed the first short story, and like I said, Leah's Diary. So the Traveller's Tale of a Very Strange Bed, I think it's called, which was super suspenseful and very creepy and really short. And you know, like, I kind of like short stories that are actually quite short. So I thought that was fantastic. But then as the stories went on, they kind of got longer and a bit more convoluted and like full of these virtuous women characters that were just unrealistic and kind of a bit annoying. And yeah, I didn't get as much out of them as I'd hoped to. By the end of it, I was really just dragging myself through because I was like, I've only got, I don't know, like an hour left in this book. I've just got to finish it. Because I'm not one for DNFing when I've got over halfway through. Yeah, so that was After Dark by Wilkie Collins. Not my best one. I think it was a very early short story collection for him, and maybe if I'd picked one of the later collections, I know some people had some fantastic experiences with his short stories this year, so I just picked a dud, basically. Then Roz's prompt was the last one to do, so that's experiencing a Victorian play, and I watched London Assurance, released on National Theatre Live, National Theatre at Home, and that was filmed in 2010 when it was on stage at the National Theatre, and the director was Nicholas Hittner. The lead roles were played by Fiona Shaw, who played Lady Gay Spanker, which is just as amusing of a character as it sounds like, and Simon Russell Beale, who played Sir Courtney Harcourt, or Sir Harcourt Courtley. So this is a fantastic play from quite early in the Victorian era. I think it's 1850s. And you can really see how it's like a precursor to later Victorian works, like The Importance of Being Earnest, for instance. And it's this brilliant comedy drama, or Charlie's Aunt, people dressed up as people that they shouldn't be, country house running in and out. I think I'm going to have to stop fairly soon. Like country house antics. It was hysterically funny, and I'm really glad that I watched it. I'm going to wrap up there. I also watched London Tide, which is a 2024 play, and Underdog, which is a 2024 play, both of which are set in Victorian era. I think it's time to stop. Thank you very much for watching, and let me know what your Victober thoughts were.